Welcome everybody to another episode of History's Benchwarmers. You are greeted by me, Adam,
And Rich.
and we are continuing today on our part 2 of 8 on the Middle Eastern podcast series. So, Rich, would you like to take us off?
Yeah, so what we're going to be looking at today is something known as the Akkadian Empire. Um, it's located in present-day Iraq. What's super interesting about the Akkadian Empire is it's one of the many firsts of the world. Um, this ancient civilization had a number of rulers who advanced society through economic planning, expansion of trade, and military campaigns. When I say, Adam, land of several firsts, it's not only considered one of the first empires in history or in Mesopotamia, but it's also one of the first dynasties. So it's super significant um, within human history. So the dates for the Akkadian Empire are pretty debatable, especially when it comes to the empire's capital, Akkad. Really don't know exactly where that was. Again, like I said, it's kind of located where present-day Iraq would be, somewhere in Mesopotamia. It's really debated between historians. It's believed that the ancient empire began around 2300 BCE and ended around 2170 BCE. The leader that is known for this time is known as Sargon the Great. He became the first ruler to take over the empire and the conquering land. And conquered land. My gosh, sorry. So during his first 5 decades of ruling, Sargon kind of went over and took over all of the surrounding land around him, which was incredible because it was a feat that was never done in history.
Mm.
This predates Alexander the Great.
Yeah, and something that's really interesting about Sargon the Great is just his story, right? So Sargon in ancient Sumerian means legitimate ruler, which we'll talk about why he's kind of named that, because he's kind of has a sketchy way of getting to the top, but most leaders do. So um, one of the important things is that he actually wasn't Sumerian. Sargon the Great was actually from the Arabian Peninsula. Now, to um, how he got to this area is kind of not talked about that much by historians. But what needs to be understood is that he wasn't of the same culture as the Sumerians were. Now, again, as we discussed in our last podcast, a lot of civilizations were near water by the Tigris and Euphrates. And where he ended up was somewhere in the little where the Tigris and Euphrates meet. And once it gets there, then it starts getting super confusing with all the different canals everywhere. Um, but he kind of has almost a Noah or a Moses type birth, right? So his mother and father were less significant in their importance of who they were, but his mother ended up putting him into a basket and sailing him down the Euphrates. So just like Moses, but instead of the Nile, it's the Euphrates. What ended up happening was that he was picked up by one of the priestesses, who was the daughter of the king at the time, and the king's name was Zababa, well, Zababa, which was the king of Kish. Kish was one of the city-states, as we discussed in our last podcast, that started spreading around all over the Tigris and Euphrates area. So what happened is that as he grew older, he was adopted into the family, and he was kind of one of the gardeners of irrigation, which was super important because the Tigris and Euphrates would flood, as we discussed in the last podcast, kind of uncontrollably. So if you were the manager or you were in charge of irrigation, your job was pretty important because you had to make sure that you had enough crops and that you were saving. So kind of also thinking back to those biblical stories of the importance of harvest and the importance of making sure that the food supply is good. But he ended up becoming the cupbearer to the king, Zababa, which was super important because you're making sure that the drink that you give the king isn't poisonous. So you had to be one of the most trusted people in his council. It's such a simple job, but I mean, the life of the king kind of laid on your hands.
Yes.
physically and well, metaphorically and in reality. Uh, so what ended up happening was that the king had a dream about Sargon, and they're very spiritual at that time. One of the gods, Inanan, I think, um, was seen crowning Sargon as king, and he was kind of the king Urzababa was falling through a lake of blood. So again, you can kind of see those parallels between Moses and this story as well. So what ended up happening was Urzababa really wanted to get Sargon out as much as possible. Now he couldn't outright kill him because you weren't allowed to do that, but he kind of had a manipulative way of doing it. So one of the other city-states, the king of Unma, Lagal Zagasi, or Zagazé, depends on how you want to pronounce it, he was coming to fight and coming to invade, which happens a lot with city-states going back and forth. So Urzababa kind of saw this as a way of getting rid of Sargon. So he sent him with a tablet saying, talk with the king and we'll negotiate some things, but I'm sending you, right? What ended up happening was that it was actually his death warrant. What the document actually read was that Sargon should be killed at the behest of the king of Unma. Now, what happened was that Sargon ended up translating the message and reading it over and figuring out, like, oh my God, he's trying to kill me. So he ended up allying himself with the king of Unma, and both of them together were able to overthrow the king of Kish, or Zababa. So after this, things just weren't working out as best as they should, as all relationships do. I mean, betrayal on betrayal doesn't really, doesn't really work out very well.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening was that both of them ended up going to war with each other. Sargon and Kish, and Zagasi and Unma. What ended up happening was that Sargon won, right? And he, as we said before, he had kind of a sketchy beginning, a sketchy way of getting the power. So that's why he ended up changing his name to Sargon of Akkad, because Sargon means legit ruler. That's kind of where it comes from, that he wanted to solidify himself as much as he could. So then you can start seeing this empire building happening. Now he starts gobbling up all those other city-states all around him to make sure that he is actually staying in power. Now his reach goes all the way from the bottom to where we have the Persian Gulf, all the way to Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, and into Iran as well. So it's a big territory. That's why, as you stated before in the beginning, that it was kind of one of the first empires in the Middle East.
Yeah.
One of the first empires in the world, because no one had really tried to do this before. Because as we talked about, city-state after city-state tried to gain power and fight against each other, but they couldn't really solidify themselves.
There's nothing united. Right.
Exactly. And to have someone who's not of Sumerian culture to unite all these Sumerian people is also something interesting that can be talked about for all different types of people throughout history. But we'll go on that later. But one of the couple things that Sargon did as one of the first empires in the world were two important things. One, he really cared for the poor. A lot of the reforms that he did was to make sure that the 99% really of the population was kept happy, because those are the people who are going to revolt. Without the people, I mean, now it's more interesting when we talk about the people, but the people are the foundation that is laid upon for governments, right? And without the people, you really have no tax base, you really have no protection, and you really have no power.
Absolutely.
Saw V for Vendetta earlier this week. Amazing movie if you haven't seen it. But
I'm glad that you finally watched it.
I know it was such a great movie. But in terms of government, like, it's true. Without the people, the government really has no power. And it's not that the people should be afraid of the government; it's the government should be afraid of its people, because it's where everything starts. We're the land that the buildings are built upon, right? The structures that we see of government.
The foundation.
Exactly. But of course, a non-Sumerian person trying to gobble up all these new lands, you can obviously tell it's going to start rebellion. A lot of people didn't like their rule, no matter how far he was. Now, of course, the farther you expand your empire, the more protection you have to be and the thinner you have to go. We learned about that in Rome, that look how far they were stretched, all the way from modern day Palestine to England. And that's a
Yep.
huge space to gather.
It is. It's a lot. It's a lot to
From,
try to protect and to take
yeah.
care of, and yeah.
So imagine these ancient empires trying to do the same thing, right? Rebellions happened everywhere, and his sons um, had to deal with that problem. There was a lot of bureaucracy problems. The elites in those city-states kind of wanted to rebel because they didn't want to pay so much money as in tribute, but also those people saw that it was a non-Sumerian ruler, so they rebelled as well. And of course, you could always say it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, which has always been kind of the course of history.
Yep.
But one of the biggest things that happened towards the end of the reign, which is about 2150 BCE, towards the end of the Akkadian Empire, was his great grandson, Nurman Sin.
No, I'm saying.
Nuramsin, exactly. And there was a lot of different things that plagued the empire.
Well, hold on. Before you go into that, I kind of want to just talk a little bit about this like dynasty.
Oh, yeah.
So like I mentioned, Sargon started this dynasty, which was super significant because that was never established in history before. For those of you who don't know what a dynasty is, it's the idea that a ruler should pass down his kingdom and down to his family, to his sons. So Sargon had a couple sons, Rimush and Manitushu. They briefly ruled after their father died. They're both involved in wars, and they really wanted to expand their the empire's land. They wanted to establish themselves as being better than their dad. As most sons probably would. But they were assassinated because they weren't Sumerian, and they were just like, "Hold on, what are you doing here? Your ideas, they're no good. They're no good." So they were assassinated. And a lot of historians think it was somebody within their own inner circle. So don't trust your friends. Keep your enemies close. Friends closer.
No,
Friends
keep your
close.
friends
Enemies
close.
closer. Yeah.
Enemies closer. Yep.
Yep. So within the empire's 180 years, there'd be a couple more rulers that would come and go. But like you were mentioning, Sargon's grandson, Naram Sin, when he took power, something super crazy, probably not seen before. That's not true. But probably not in the Mesopotamian era, especially for the Akkadian Empire. He is identified himself as a god, and he basically stated that I rule the whole world. And that, yeah, so the rulers of these empires, try to make their sons governors and of major cities and establish their daughters high priestesses in order to maintain control. So spreading that dynasty further, if we look at a fiefdom, or looking into the Middle Ages, a king would have his dukes, and the dukes would have everybody else. It'd just be spread out, and everybody would be a good family lineage, and that's essentially what was established here through Sargon the Great and his dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty cool because the Akkadian Empire did something that most Mesopotamian empires weren't able to do. They unified city-states. They unified them under a tax system, and then they helped build walls and irrigation waterways to try to help make the flooding of the Euphrates and the Tigris a little more sustainable. Sorry, went off on a tangent.
No, you're good, and that's something I definitely want to get back to, because Neuron Sin did something that was, as you stated, frowned upon. Right, the importance of priests and priestesses being close, having connections with the gods, was awesome. You needed that. You needed to see why they were angry with you, why they were happy with you, if they were going to bestow blessings upon you. But to kind of scratch out the middleman and just say, well, I'm a god myself, kind of changes the entire culture of the Sumerian people. I mean, one of the stone tablets that's seen of him, pictured with his army, is that he's wearing a crown with horns on it. Now, the only people who were really pictured like that were gods, deities, people of importance. And to see that him with his army having a crown like that would just shake everybody to the core. All these people who were upset with the tax system that there was, all these people who didn't like a foreign ruler, now had more of a justification, a religious justification, to throw him out of power.
Yeah.
And the other things that fell with that during that time was bad government. I mean, he was more focused on militaristic expansion and less caring about the domestic problems that were going around. You also had a very poor harvest. During that time, there was more flooding. A lot of crops weren't growing like they were, so people were starving and dying. And with starvation and poor harvest comes diseases. People are dying left and right. And what you do is you bring more people into these cities. The more people you have in the cities, the faster diseases spread. Now people are dying.
Well, the reason they spread is because they have city walls.
Right.
So they're enclosing everything inside of the walls, which is why diseases are able to spread more.
Exactly. And then, of course, you still have the problems that Sargon never, or his sons never really got over, which was revolt. People didn't like these foreign innovators. They would lose, and then probably like a couple months later, they would just start again.
Yeah.
And you'd have to go from one part of the empire to the other, back and forth, all over, from north, south, east, and west, to get all of these rebellions quarreled. And not only does that cost a lot of money to do that, because back then, and even still now, to arm people is truly expensive.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so with that kind of money back then, you had to pay these people, and you had to travel so much with them. And it's hard because, I mean, to be a soldier, you had to be trained. I mean, you still have to be trained. I mean, now when we have guns, it's a little easier. It's still training that you have to take, but it's a gun. You can learn a lot quicker than it would be to hold and fight with a sword and shoot a bow and arrow, have a shield, things like that. So you'd have to train these people, which costs even more money to do that, and time and effort. And then you can also say kind of natural disasters. Of course, you could say with the Great Flooding, and then divine retribution. So that's something that scholars don't want to disprove because there's not really a lot of evidence to not. And plus, they're very spiritual, so of course they're going to write a lot about the spirituality that was happening around that time. But for someone to say, for the pantheon of gods that they had, for someone to say, well, I am a god, me as a human am a god, that's not only going to make the people angry, but it's going to make the gods angry. And they're going to do everything that they can to make sure that your empire doesn't last as long as you want it to.
Yep. So, like, looking at that idea of culture, when we talked about Tebeki Tepe, I kind of talked about some of the artwork that was significant there. During this time, a lot of the artwork that was produced, again, is essentially realism. The style didn't really require a lot of imagination. It was just, I see what it is, and I'm going to paint or draw or create what I see in front of me. A lot of times, some like the artwork was presented would be of gods and goddesses who possessed human-like traits. So a lot of these gods would be associated with nature, and they would be associated with controlling the changing seasons. So Sargon the First actually kind of became a god who governed the other gods. So because he was such a great king, he essentially became a god in the pantheon. The sky god Utu, the sun god Enlil. And on the sky god, Utu, the sun god, Enlil, the air god, Nana, the moon god, were all worshipped, and they were so significant within that pantheon. What's also really cool about this culture was bilingualism developed. The Akkadians and Sumerians were two different types of cultures. And it's super significant because these cultures hated each other. But under the Akkadian rule, bilingualism developed. Like if you think of much of the United States today, with Spanish and English becoming very common, people take Spanish classes, take English classes. That became very much common in the Akkadian Empire, and a lot of the components of separate languages were borrowed, but eventually they became meshed together, where the Akkadian language became the dominant language in the empire, where Sumerian was used in rituals and scholarly work.
Yeah. So I think we have reached our time for today on the Akkadian Empire. A lot of the takeaways that you could see, it didn't last very long, but still being one of the first empires to ever step foot on, on this earth was something of remarks, something that can be talked about and studied for a long time. But yeah. So this concludes our part 2 of our Middle East series. We are going to.
Well, before we finish up, I think it'd probably be important to talk about like the fall of the empire. I know you kind of mentioned that part of the reason that the empire fell was because lack of food. So like the floods, lack of food, famine, disease. How long did that go on for?
So, I mean, it was something that plagued even Sargon's time when he was expanding. So even from the start of when Sargon took over to his 2 sons, to his grandson, it was something that was always a constant problem and things that never really got resolved. But they kept expanding. They kept spreading outward instead of kind of solidifying inward, which again makes sense. You know, the more materials you have, I guess you can solve more problems, but of course the more you spread out, the more problems you inevitably have, and taking care of those different types of people and different kinds of people really really can be detrimental to an empire, to a nation state, but to that idea of a collective people under one ruler.
Yeah. So sometime around 2170 BCE, the Gutians, not sure how to pronounce it, they were barbarians from Zagros Mountain. They came in and invaded the empire. It was almost like perfect divine timing for the Gutians because the Akkadian Empire was so weak. They had no money, they had no food, they were struggling. The leader at the time, Shar Kali Shari, he spent a lot of his money, he spent a lot of his resources and soldiers fighting off the outside attacks from these kingdoms, as well as like internal revolts. Because obviously, like you mentioned, if there's no food, you've got a weak government, people are going to say, hey, enough is enough. Like, we need to get away from this guy. So he spent all of his time fighting the attacks. When he's spending all his time, money, and energy fighting, he's not able to maintain order within. And it kind of like imploded. Mm-hmm. So that was part of the big reason. It's kind of just a string of bad luck for the Akkadian Empire. But again, like we mentioned, it was already kind of weakened at some points. Harvest, climate changes, like and weather patterns kind of affected everything and kind of destroyed the Akkadian Empire. Then the Gutians were just like, "Sup, coming in."
Honestly, and that's something that I think needs to be talked about too. That all powerful countries really, or not even countries, but rulers, empires, nation states, city states. I mean, after a certain amount of time, they do start to erode. Things start to fall apart, and it's just it's inevitable. I mean, look at all these. I mean, for an example, with Europe, I mean, it's been around for so long. Some of these nations, but the toils that it continues to have, and you can even see it still today. And that's something that the Akkadians suffered, and that we'll learn about when we talk about the Bronze Age with the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and even when we get later on to Alexander the Great and the Islamic states. that ended up, the Islamic Empire that happened after a certain amount of time, maybe 100 years, maybe 150 years, 200, 300, 400, eventually stuff happens. You get bad governments, you get bad rulers, you get
Yeah.
natural disasters that happen. Sometimes even in some aspects, divine retribution, and even revolts from the people from within. And I guess that's something that should be discussed about how long really a government can stand.
Yeah, I agree. Um, in closing statements, again, I know I said like let's talk about the fall before we close, but
Right.
also,
That's my fault.
it also seems almost like doomy, gloomy type of like, hey, this empire, it was awesome, it was around for X amount of years, but yeah, they sucked the entire time. It's not exactly the way we want it to be portrayed.
Right.
Um, there were so many technological and economic advancements that the Akkadian Empire had. Agriculture was like the biggest part of this economy or this empire's like thriving economy. They built fortresses in Assyria, and that was to protect and control wheat production. Um, that wheat production was so important to them because if they had outsiders coming in to take it, like that's their money, that's their food. So they needed to have a strong military and they needed to have a well-fed population so that people were like, hey, cool, I'm happy with this. Um, there were also so many skilled craftsmen that were working with copper and lead. They created statues of Argon's son, Rimush, and like they created copper statues in general. So these metals weren't regularly used at that time. So it was significant because they were one of the first empires to also use copper. Um, it was different. You know, they were smithing. In addition, the Akkadians built a road system that connected all of their major cities, which made it easier for transportation of people, goods, going from one place to another. They also created a type of postal service with like stamps and seals that were made from clay. The empire also had a calendar that was used by the Akkadians, which in later years kind of became the establishing calendar for us. So, yeah, some of the significant points of the Akkadian Empire and why it's relative to us. With that, I think that's all of the time that we now have for the Akkadian Empire. So, leave your comments in the box below, subscribe, tell your friends, share, tell us what you think.
Yeah. And we will see you guys next week on our next episode when we talk about the Bronze Age. So,
Peace.
catch you on the flip flop.
Peace.
Peace.